this on your end too, I hope, or you'll be able to share it later at the very least.
Okay.
All right, we are live. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Mythic Mission. This is episode number 31 of Mythic Mission. I can't believe it. We started this podcast in January, 30 plus episodes in. Today's episode is entitled Science in the Mind of the Maker, and I have for interview today Dr. Melissa Cain-Travis, and as always, I'm your host, Michael Jahoski. So it's good to see everybody again. Let me introduce our guest today, and then we're going to dive right in. And I know Dr. Travis has some current projects that she'd like to keep you all updated on towards the end that you don't want to miss. So make sure that you go back and watch this, and I'll have tons of links to the things that she references in the show notes, whether you're listening on the podcast on Anchor, Spotify, iTunes, or if you're on YouTube, you'll have access to that. And Dr. Travis, is your book still on sale on Kindle? I saw that you posted something about that.
I actually haven't checked today. It was on sale yesterday. Don't know about today.
Well, that's great. If it is, and you're an ebook fiend like me, gobble it up while you can for a great price. You won't be sorry. Okay, let me introduce our guest. Dr. Travis earned a Ph.D. in Humanities with a philosophy concentration from Faulkner University, where her dissertation research focused on the natural philosophy and natural theology of Johannes Kepler. She earned a Master of Arts in Science and Religion from Biola University and a Bachelor of Science in General Biology from Campbell University. She has taught courses in philosophy, ancient culture, and science and faith since 2013. She's also a newly minted member of the writing team at Worldview Bulletin. Melissa is the author of Science in the Mind of the Maker, which is the book we'll be discussing today, and has contributed a chapter, to the story of the cosmos. She worked as a bench scientist in the fields of biotechnology and pharmaceutical research for 5 years after obtaining her undergraduate degree, and has spent nearly 2 decades exploring the science, theology, and philosophy related to the origins debate. So Dr. Travis, I'm very honored to have you on the show. I loved your book. I've been following you here on social media for a while. Thank you so much for joining me. Did we lose her? Uh-oh.
Oh, you're unfrozen now. You froze for a second.
I was frozen. Okay, you were frozen. I was frozen. Great. Thank you for joining me today is the last thing I said. So we will go ahead and dive right in. Sorry for that hiccup. Hopefully everybody can see and hear us okay still.
No worries, but I want to say thank you for having me. And in honor of Mythic Mission, I wore my Tolkien t-shirt.
Wonderful. I love it. I tried to dig out one of mine. I couldn't find it. And the other one I've just outgrown since my 20s, but I did bring the Riddle of Strider. It's hard to see, of course, but it's on the wall behind me. My wife made me for, I think it was our anniversary this year, 12-year marriage anniversary here. And again, it's in that like burnt parchment look. So it's great.
Yeah. So right behind me, you probably can't make it out. You probably can't make it out in the video, but I have a blanket that's a map of Middle Earth.
Oh, we have that one. That's awesome.
Oh, do you?
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. It's we're Tolkien nerds. That's great. I'm not ashamed of it. So thanks for being thematic for today.
Sure.
All right. Well, I want to start with your passion about the intersection of science, theology, and philosophy, but kind of weave that into why you wrote this book, Science in the Mind of the Maker. Let's start with that.
Sure. My story goes back very far, all the way back to early elementary school when I discovered a deep love for science. I'm old enough to be able to say that the greatest day of the week in elementary school was film strip day. Do you guys remember film strips? Like this was before the days when there were VCRs in the classroom even. That's how old I am.
Okay.
So film strip day was always the greatest because it was usually something on dinosaurs or volcanoes or earthquakes or something marvelous and geeky sciencey like that. So very early on, I developed a love for the natural sciences. Now, I grew up in a rather rural edge of suburbia part of North Carolina in very small Southern Baptist churches. So there weren't intellectual conversations going on in my world during these formative years. it wasn't until I got to my upper high school years that I started to have this inkling that there's a perceived tension between the findings of science, especially the origin sciences, and the Christian faith. Mm. And I started asking a few tentative questions in my faith community, and I never got satisfactory answers. There weren't answers really to be had from the people in my faith community. Mm. So after high school graduation, I went on to do a bachelor's degree in biology, but I was at a small private Christian university. And my experience there was that the controversial parts, if you will, of the conversation were barely even touched on. I remember walking into my first general biology class my freshman year, and the professor, Dr. Beard, I still remember, he was so delightful. Nice. Dr. Beard walked to the front of the room, and on the chalkboard, we used the old school chalkboards when I was in college.
What are those?
Right. He wrote a Bible verse on the board before he had even greeted the class for the very first time. So he set this tone of teaching biology within the context of a Christian classroom, but we never discussed things like naturalistic origins theories and so on and so forth. So I got all the way to undergraduate graduation with this idea that maybe the conversation is not all that high profile in the intellectual world. Maybe this is something that had just occurred to me, and it's not really something I needed to be very worried about. Mm. After graduation, I went straight into the workforce. I started working for a biotechnology lab in Houston, Texas. And it was during that time that I got thrown into the deep end of the pool, so to speak, because here I was, this bachelor's level biology nerd in a lab that contained people with advanced degrees in the sciences. Some of them were PhDs, some of them were longtime PhDs in the natural sciences. And inevitably, the conversations would come up. We're sitting belly up to the lab bench doing our thing in the lab, and you get bored and you start talking about things other than work, and the big questions would always come up. Mm-hmm. And what I discovered through what I like to refer to a little tongue-in-cheek as my series of humiliating events is that we would have conversation after conversation during which I would be plied with questions about the intersection of my faith with my love of science that I could not offer good responses to. And I felt like a complete failure when it came to the evangelistic part of my mission as a Christian. Mm-hmm. And this went on for a few years, and finally, to make a much longer story a little shorter, I discovered the discipline of apologetics. And not only did I discover that there was such a thing as apologetics, but I discovered that there was an entire branch of that discipline devoted to the science and faith conversation. Right. And it was not long after this discovery that I became a mom and decided to spend the first several years of motherhood at home with my little kids, and had the opportunity between diapers and feedings and all the things to do a lot of self-study. And I did. And I became a voracious reader of all things science and faith. Started doing a little bit of teaching at church during that era, and discovered quite serendipitously the master's degree program at Biola University in science and religion. I did not even know that science and religion was an academic discipline. Mm-hmm. And I was delighted and applied right away and did that master's program. Took a year off after that, and then went back and did a Ph.D. in the humanities with a philosophy concentration. Now, a lot of people say, what? You went from biology to science and faith, and then you made this weird leap over to the humanities. What is that all about?
Yeah.
Well, it's rooted in my very favorite class in my master's program at Biola, and the title of the class was the history and philosophy of science.
Mm.
And it was
Great.
my epiphany about the fact that when you have the science and faith conversation, it's really not just about science and faith. There's all this history and philosophy that's interwoven deeply into this subject matter. And so learning that led me on more of a classical trajectory in my intellectual interests. And I discovered a great books Ph.D. program that had enough latitude and flexibility to allow me to continue on this exploration of the science and faith conversation, but to do so within the context of the great Western tradition. Mm-hmm. So I was able to start with some of the most ancient literature that survives to today and trace lots of these ideas all the way up to the 21st century, which was one of the most joyful, albeit difficult processes that I've ever been through.
Oh, that's
that's my background. And it was during my doctoral studies that I developed the vision for the book Science in the Mind of the Maker.
Yes, thank you so much for going through that. And I can really tell that, you know, the philosophy behind the scientific enterprise is a major theme of the book. And two things to just mention. I have a colleague and friend. I teach humanities at a small state college here in Florida, St. Petersburg College. Tim Walter, one of my friends, I think also is earning his Ph.D. from Faulkner. I don't know if he's doing the literature track. I don't know which track he's doing. He's doing one of them. So I hear that's a great program and it sounds like a lot of fun. And, you know, I'm always all about the humanities. So that's great that you did that. You know, and the second thing I just want to mention, I've just recently had a conversation with a few students who heard me say philosophy of science, and they looked at me like I had, you know, like I had six heads. And what do you mean philosophy of science? So that's an oxymoron. And I think this is going to be very helpful. I hope some of my students are listening and are going to, you know, hear that this is a very, very well-trodden field and very important one. So let me get into my second question. Thank you again for telling us about your passion. That was wonderful to hear. And it's a great story. So speaking of stories, I don't know, you know, to dwell on this too much, but I always like to ask my guests about, and I know from what you do and what I see you doing on Facebook sometimes that you're probably familiar with the word myth. So just how would you understand that term? We'll start there. And then my next question is kind of just a logical corollary of that one.
Sure. So my definition of myth hopefully will resonate strongly with yours. I might not articulate it as well as you do, since this is not something I'm called upon to do very often.
That's okay.
But very briefly, I would define myth as a story that tells true things, right? An important story that tells fundamental truths. Mm-hmm. Now, it doesn't do it in a literalistic way, right? And so we can have a myth of something, and it would be incorrect to call it false. Mm-hmm. But it's something that serves as an overarching, if you will, framework for the things that we're doing.
Yeah, that's exactly how I understand it. For those of you that are listening and haven't heard me mention this before, and I'm sure Dr. Travis, you're familiar with Alistair McGrath's books. I love the way that he treats the concept of mythos and going all the way back to ancient Greek thinking to trace this concept. So I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with just that definition to begin with. So thank you. That's excellent definition. And then the corollary of that, I wanted to ask a follow-up question. Would you say that people, and I have so many of them in my classrooms all the time, they have this assumption that the scientific methods, methodologies, and the scientific worldview or worldviews, and we might say, are the exclusive means for telling the truth about the world we live in, that it's rational, it's evidence-based, and therefore, of course, true. Whereas, say the humanities is irrational. They don't even say non-rational. Often it's irrational. It's blind faith. It's true for you, which is another way of saying really not true at all. Would you say that people living within the former view, the understanding of science, are living within your definition of myth or our definition of myth here? Would you say that they're living within a framework?
Yes, I would absolutely say that they are. This idea is very much a meta-narrative, and we really could call it the implicit meta-narrative of contemporary secularism, I think. So science, right? Science, capital S, tends to be viewed, especially in this season we're living in, as this unimpeachable monolith thing, right? That it's regarded as the source of objective truths about reality. And so what it produces is knowledge that every rational person must affirm. And so beliefs that are rooted instead in philosophical reflection or religious writings are very subservient to the real knowledge, the objective knowledge, the rational knowledge that science, capital S, produces for us.
Yeah,
so the things that we would refer to as philosophical or religious are just these subjective things that at best are respected opinions about the world. And there's a technical term for this meta-narrative, as we're calling it, with science with a capital S. And the term is scientism. So to use the fancy philosophy word, this is an epistemology, a theory of knowledge that we refer to as scientism. And it has a few pretty glaring problems, actually.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue. Thank you. That was an excellent response. And I love that we kind of share the same understanding of myth. And I think that will be very helpful to a lot of people listening. Before we get into chapter 1 of your book, I want to say, I'm sure you probably have come across this, and in many apologetic books, I've seen this distinction. It's very important that we often hear, what science has to say, what science has to say, but it's scientists who are doing the saying. Science doesn't say anything. It's scientists who have views about science. I think you mentioned something like this later in your book, in fact, and I always felt that was a really healthy correction to what we hear most people, especially in my classes, when we talk about religion, well, science says, and I always like to point out, scientists is probably a better way to approach that. And not even all scientists at that, as I'm sure you would agree, including yourself. So, okay. So chapter 1, let's get into, you just mentioned scientism. If you want to, make any more passes at that concept for people. I know there are different varieties of scientism. There's a hard and a soft. I think you were kind of referring to the hard variety there. And people hear the word naturalism a lot. Could you explain these terms just a little bit more? And then we'll talk about some other things from chapter 1 of your book.
Yeah. So I mentioned that there are some very serious problems with this epistemology we're referring to as scientism. And you're correct. There's sort of a spectrum of scientism. So you can have very soft scientism that would say something like, well, the knowledge that science produces is just more reliable, more objective than the knowledge that we can get from other things like philosophical reflection or religious writings. So it still makes those things secondary and less than the knowledge that we get from science. And then you go all the way down the spectrum to a very hard form of scientism, which would say unequivocally the only thing that produces real knowledge are the empirical sciences. And the problem that you run into with a lot of spots on the spectrum leading up to the harder scientism is that it's a self-defeating claim. And by that, I mean, if you say the only path to objective knowledge is science, that's not a statement that can be tested by science. So you've kind of shot yourself in the foot with that very statement. That's what we mean in philosophy when we call something a self-defeating statement.
Right.
The other problem with that meta-narrative, that mythos, trying to live within that is virtually impossible. And if not impossible, which I would say it is, I would plant my flag there. But if not impossible, then very unhappy and very difficult to do, because test tubes and bioreactors don't produce any information whatsoever on meaning, value, and purpose. So we can't find out what's good and what's evil in a science lab. We can't find out that human beings are intrinsically valuable in a science lab, for example. So imagine how quickly society would collapse if everyone here lived as if a harder version of scientism were true, right? None of those things could be called true. We couldn't say it is objectively wrong to kill your next door neighbor for fun. Science can't tell us anything of the sort. So those are the kind of problems you run into. And I would also be willing to say with the utmost confidence that if you try to live as if scientism is true, you can't have any real meaningful relationship with the world around you, because the things that really matter deeply to human existence, and let me also use the word humane existence, are usually completely separate from anything science can tell us.
I would agree completely. And I think what we're finding is a lot of people who, at least in my teaching career, claim to view the world this way, but I ask them sometimes, especially when we do ethics, I mean, do you really live this way consistently? I think it's quite impossible to, but it's almost as if a lot of people think they can live that way theoretically, but then they turn it off when something really meaningful or important or ethical presses in upon them, because then, you have to suspend that. So I think, you're right. I would agree in planting your flag there that it is impossible. I would even find problems with soft scientism as well, as I'm sure you would. How would we know, for example, how would we know scientifically and empirically that science is a better yielder of knowledge and truth about reality? So it seems inconsistent, but thank you for clarifying that. I want to talk about the central part of your book and chapter 1, which is the Makers Thesis. And this is just I got excited about, reading it early on in the book and then looking for it. And I thought, because I do a lot of studies in Stoicism and Christianity, and when we get to chapter 2, I'll mention, I even brought in a couple of notes that I think the Stoics were natural theologians as well, and kind of seeing this. But you talk about the Makers Thesis. What is it, and how is it kind of the theme of your book?
The Maker Thesis is the claim that in diverse branches of the natural sciences, we find indicators that there is an intelligence that transcends nature. But in addition to that, there is something very special about the human person, particularly human rationality, that allows us to detect these signals of transcendence, if you will. I love that phrase.
Me too.
And so there's this resonance happening, and that is the very resonance that makes the scientific enterprise even possible in the first place.
Yeah, it's brilliant. This amazing kinship between our rational minds and a rationally intelligible universe. Not people hear sometimes intelligible and think we know everything, and that's not, of course, what you or anybody's saying. Is that it's knowable to begin with, when it could have easily been any other way, and we'll get into that in future chapters. But thank you, that's excellent. And as a segue into chapter 2, where you talk about the kind of attestation of natural theology in pre-Christian literature and thinking, but also in the early church fathers. I think Athanasius and Augustine feature prominently there. Could you define what natural theology is for those of us who are not familiar with it? And then the major question here to discuss chapter 2 is, what is natural theology, and how well attested is this across different thinkers and even outside of Christianity?
I love this question. Natural theology, just to put it very simply, is the practice of using our human reasoning powers and our human observations to investigate the world around us and to detect what I'm calling these signals of transcendence, or these signs of there being an intelligent creator behind the natural world. But we do this specifically without the help of any sort of special revelation. And special revelation obviously would include the Christian scriptures.
Right.
So we're starting without scripture as a foundation. Rather, we're observing the world and we're observing truths about ourselves as human beings. And it's through this project we call natural theology that we can discern some very important things that are then corroborated by what scripture tells us. And one major example of that would be the existence of God. And I would go further than that and say, as the Makers Thesis says, that we can also surely, just using natural theology, we can discern that there's something really distinct about human beings compared to any other creatures that gives us this capacity to carry out a project like this, or to carry out the project of the natural sciences. And then we see clear affirmations of natural theology in scripture. Romans 1:20 is sort of the poster verse for natural theology, because Paul tells us that God has made his attributes and his existence so obvious to us through the things he has made that there's no human being that's without excuse. And then Psalm 19, another favorite, the heavens declare the glory of God. So scriptures like these, and there are many others that I could cite, are clear that the created world, the beautiful nature that's all around us, attests to the existence of God. So for those that would sort of turn their nose up at the project of natural theology, these are good verses to point to, because they're telling us, oh no, even those that lived before Christianity and those who have never heard of Christianity, they have sufficient evidence to conclude the existence of a creator.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I think this raises another question. I don't know if we want to go down this rabbit hole, but I always love to talk about natural theology and soteriology and the question of those who lived before Christ. How are they judged? Because this is general revelation, what you're also alluding to, for those that are familiar with that phrase. And so is general revelation sufficient enough for people living before Christ? And what about after, on this side of the cross? I don't know about you, but I've always found that question very important and deep.
It is one of my top theological conversation topics.
Oh, cool.
And has been for years.
I'm glad I'm not alone.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you want to say a few words on that, but then I just wanted to ask you about a few of the people you mentioned. I was really happy to see Philo in there, and also the Wisdom of Solomon, which remind me, was that Dead Sea Scroll literature, or is it in the Apocrypha? I can't recall. Where can people get
just
that today?
Jewish wisdom literature that would have been penned during the intertestamental period.
Got it. Okay. So I wondered if we could go through a few examples, maybe even Plato, Philo, how some of these thinkers who were not Christian, Philo was Jewish, but, thought about natural theology and discerned this correlation between rational minds and a rational God and intelligible universe. So maybe we should do that first. And if we have time, we can talk about some other things before moving on.
Sure.
Okay.
One of the most delightful things about this topic to me is that we can go all the way back to the earliest records of Western philosophy and see clear indications that natural theology was a project that was already going on among the intellectuals of the time. And Pythagoras is one of my favorite examples. And if any of the listeners have read my book, they know why. But Pythagoras, who lived in the late 6th, early 5th century BC, he left behind no writings, but we know a good deal of his thought and his doctrines based upon the school of philosophy that was founded based upon his oral teachings. So Pythagoreanism might be a better way to refer to these ideas rather than Pythagoras's ideas, because we know that there was some revision that went on in there. Certainly. But Pythagoreanism, one of its central tenets is that we can look at the order and harmony that exists in nature. And we can conclude that there is a rational principle behind this, that this isn't the result of just blind matter in motion doing its thing, and they didn't have the fancy philosophical terms for materialism, naturalism, so on and so forth back then, but they were able to talk about there being this rational principle behind nature. And for the early Pythagoreans, at least, they thought, well, it must be that number or these mathematical principles are the reality, that everything is at its essence number. That's how they expressed this perception they had that there's rationality in the natural world. And so Pythagoras's ideas, or the Pythagorean ideas, went on to influence philosophy rather heavily. And Plato was our main conduit for these Pythagorean ideas. So he received Pythagorean ideas as they existed by his time, which was almost a century later, several decades later, after the death of this shadowy figure, Pythagoras. So Plato receives these ideas and develops them in his own writings, notably the Republic and the Timaeus. And the Timaeus is the Platonic dialogue that talks about the creation of the world. You see lots of juicy Pythagorean themes in the Timaeus. It's my favorite dialogue.
Yeah.
So Plato develops these ideas. And then, as many of your listeners may know, Platonism went on to be highly influential in early Christianity and shaping the way we talk about the attributes of God. For example, God as being this rational, the term that you'll hear most frequently is logos, right? This rational mind, this this thinker that transcends the material, that very rooted in this Platonic idea, right? So then you fast forward a little bit and you see Platonism influencing early Christianity. Well, first, we'll talk about Philo. So Philo lived during the time of the events that are recorded in the New Testament, but he wasn't over in that region. So we have Philo of Alexandria, a Jew, a very Hellenistic Jew, meaning highly educated in all of the ancient Greek learning. And he loved this, what I would call a Pythagorean Platonic idea of there being a rational principle behind the world. And that's what we see made manifest in the order and harmony of nature. Well, he said, well, of course, there's a rational principle behind all things that we're seeing made manifest in nature, but this is a rationality that is in the very mind of God. So what he did was he took this idea of there being a nebulous rational principle out there in abstract land, and he said, no, all of this rationality has existed from eternity, but in the mind of God. And so when we look at nature, it is a manifestation of the Creator's mind in a very real sense, because what we're seeing are the results of his rational plan for creation coming to fruition in how nature is structured. So what was wonderful about Philo is we saw this beautiful grafting together of the best of ancient Greek thought with monotheism, Jewish monotheism. And Philo went on to be highly influential in some regions of early Christianity. And then we see some of the earlier church fathers, and we see St. Augustine. Hopefully everyone will recognize the name St. Augustine, carrying on some of these Pythagorean Platonic ideas about the rationality of God being made manifest in nature. And it is through observing the order and harmony in nature that we perceive something of the transcendent.
Yeah, it's
and then from there,
incredible.
we can easily trace what came to be known as the two books metaphor. So we see the two books metaphor sort of emerging with the century before St. Augustine, and we see it in St. Augustine, and we see it in subsequent prominent early theologians, this idea that we have the book of nature and we have the book of scripture. So we have these two books to give us a more comprehensive picture of God and his attributes, and how his mind is made manifest in everything that he has made. And that two books metaphor, this general revelation and special revelation held together, was a prominent theme all the way up to the scientific revolution.
It's incredible. And I have so many thoughts swimming in my head here that I want to respond. That was a very clear explanation. Thank you. I think people are going to be very excited about this and learning more about it. I want to recommend some other resources too, in case anybody's interested. For me, just from a passion of mine, I've always been fascinated with Stoic thought and Christian thought, and also the question, like you, of the unsaved people before Christ, but in particular the relationship of Christianity and non-Christian religions. And I think a lot of people will be concerned, perhaps the Christians in the audience, that did Christianity borrow these ideas, like the idea of logos, because it lacked them, or did it recognize itself in other traditions? And this is a great topic that a lot of people are writing about today. We can't address it in today's podcast, but maybe in a future one we can. But I know I hear people saying that, and there's good answers to that. But setting that aside for now, I just want to mention something from Seneca, because he's one of the great Stoic thinkers. And just to support what you've said, another great book on this, if anybody's interested in how natural theology and Stoic thought and Christian thought kind of correlate, Christopher Cavan Rowe has a book, I think it's called One True Life, if I'm not mistaken. He's got a couple of books, but he quotes and talks about Seneca in one chapter, and he says, Seneca says this: divine reason is set in supreme command over all things and is itself subject to none. And when speaking about human rationality, Seneca is quick to point out that nothing else than a portion of the divine spirit is set in the human body, which I thought was just a marvelous tie-in to what you've said. Human reason is the same as divine reason because it is derived from divine reason. And so for those that might be interested in just those two traditions, obviously the Christian tradition and Stoic tradition, just how those two kind of engage on this subject, that's a great book.
That's awesome. I'm glad to hear about that. I didn't know about it, but it ties right in with some of the Pythagorean Platonic thoughts. So for example, Plato believed that the reason we can detect the harmony and order in the natural world is because our very souls contain the same harmonies and order. And that's why there's a resonance between the two.
So beautiful.
Such a beautiful way to say it, right?
I was just going to say, music, and thinking of Tolkien's creation myth and how the universe came into being through harmony and music, and then the disharmony of Melkor. So now we're in full nerd mode.
Funny that you mentioned that, because I was just listening to Alistair McGrath's most recent podcast when I was driving my son to school this morning. And it just so happens that the episode was on the magician's nephew. And they were talking about the musical creation when Aslan sings Narnia into existence. Very Pythagorean Platonic themes going on there.
Yep. Music of the spheres, and it's all beautiful. Great stuff. Well, okay, I'd love to just linger more on that subject. We have to move on to chapter 3. You start to present some evidence, scientific evidence and findings for the universe having a beginning and what the implications of this are. And so phrase a question this way, I hope it's phrased correctly, but what evidence might there be for the universe having a beginning, and how might this suggest evidence for a creator? And why God? Why not, the multiverse theory or something else that people like to throw out there instead?
Right. So for most of human history, the thought was that our universe was probably eternal, right? So very Aristotelian idea. And even medieval Christians, well, Thomas Aquinas, let me not generalize. Thomas Aquinas, for example, did not see a problem with the suggestion of an eternal universe. And I won't go into how he squared that with there being, a creation. But I just wanted to make the point very briefly that there were even great Christian thinkers before the early 20th century, which I'm about to talk about, who thought you could square an eternal universe with Orthodox Christian doctrine.
Wow.
But if we fast forward to the early 20th century, we get to what I like to refer to as the great physics revolution of the 20th century. So this would be the time during which Einstein, Max Planck, and those great luminaries of physics were living and doing their marvelous work. Einstein was developing his theory of general relativity, and there were equations in his theory that strongly suggested a non-static universe, meaning a universe that was just in this steady state from all eternity. And he wrestled with the equations, trying to figure out what went wrong in his theory, right? Because it just wasn't acceptable to him to think the universe hadn't always been in a static state from eternity.
Wow.
So he's working on that. And a priest and astronomer named Georges Lemaitre was working on these equations of Einstein's, and he developed solutions that were quite elegant and solved the problem, but they suggested a universe that was in a state of expansion. And he actually had a personal conversation with Einstein about this. And Einstein was really stubborn about it. He's like, no, that suggests too much the creation. Those were the words that he used. So he could not stomach the thought of this.
Wow.
But to make a long story short, others were working on the equations, coming up with similar results. Alexander Friedman is an example who was doing this same work at this same time. But then we get to 1929 and the telescopic observations of the famous Edwin Hubble. And Hubble observed some things through his microscope, made some measurements that clearly indicated that no matter what direction you point a telescope from the Earth, you're going to detect let's say information, let's just call it information, that tells us that everything, all the galaxies around the Milky Way galaxy are rushing away from us at a very high rate of speed. And the further away they get, the faster they go. Wow. In other words, space itself is expanding, right? So if you think about that hypothetically in reverse, everything's coming back together, closer, denser, hotter, until you get down to an infinitely dense, infinitely hot, infinitesimal point, right? From which all things emerged at the moment of what we now call the Big Bang moment.
Right.
So we had this mathematical evidence from theoretical physics, and then we had this telescopic observation, and all of this has come together to form what we call the standard model of cosmology that is, while not unanimously attested to by present day cosmologists, it enjoys an extremely high degree of support. I've heard it referred to over and over as the best, the theory with the best empirical support of any other scientific theory.
Wow.
So here we have this theory that clearly tells us that there was a point in the finite past at which all of matter, all of empty space, and even time itself came into existence very suddenly from absolutely nothing.
Wow. Yeah. That's incredible. And you talk about Plonk Time, which is that moment right before, is it right before the beginning where we can't really peer past the curtain? Is
It's
that
not before,
before?
it's a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of a second
Okay.
after.
Well, that makes sense.
Right. So Stephen Hawking, the late Stephen Hawking liked to use this phrase, the blue touch paper, right?
Oh,
So you
okay.
you light a piece of blue touch paper to set off a chemical chain reaction. And so the idea is the touch paper was lit, but then there is this in tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of a second after that is opaque to us in terms of scientific investigation, because the very laws of physics break down when you try to get further back than that.
Yeah, because that would be the beginning of physics, wouldn't it, at that moment, and everything else.
Right.
So that's an incredibly terrifying thought in a sense, an amazing thought, but humbling to kind of hear that a large degree of the scientific community views it that way and realizes that there's really nothing more we can do to go and understand further back than that. So where might I say faith comes in, and
yeah, so there are speculative hypotheses that are all built on mathematical modeling, right? And so we can't have true empirical support. We can just build models and see if the models are coherent. It's the best we can do.
Sounds about right. That's incredible. And before we move on to chapter 6 and 10, I want to make sure we have enough time and we're respectful of your time. You know, what are some of the other things that especially secular scientists might throw out and say, you know, this eternal model, I mean, there are still some people that hold to that view in spite of the evidence, isn't that right?
There's a minority
Okay.
that want to hold to this idea.
Mm.
Yeah, and there are various models, if you will, that speculate about how this could have been. But they all run into a serious philosophical problem, and that very serious philosophical problem is that you cannot have an infinite past series of events, or we could even use the word moments and moments in time. You can't just have an infinite regress.
Right.
So say what you will about our standard model of cosmology, there is no escaping the fact that there had to have been an ultimate beginning. And we say this from a logical perspective, because you just can't keep going back forever. If you think about that, there being an infinite past series of events that can't be traversed to get to today.
No.
Right? How do you get through an infinite past series and arrive somewhere ever? And the same with moments in time, because some would suggest, well, our time began at the Big Bang moment, but there's a meta timeline in which we are just this little bubble of our kind of time. But even postulating this meta time idea runs into the problem of sequential moments or sequential events, and you can't come from an infinite. Right. And so sense. we often refer to this as the impossibility of an infinite past series.
Yeah, and I think you distinguish this in your book, though, from a different kind of infinity. I can't remember how you put it, as an actual infinity versus something else.
A potential.
Potential.
Right. Because often someone will respond, well, but there are infinite numbers. Like we could start counting 1, 2, 3, and that can go on forever into future eternity. And that's a different type of that's a potential infinity, right? Because you're just never going to stop. It's just going to keep going and going and going and going. There's no end point. But when we're talking about a past infinity, that's a different kind of thing. We have to ask if it's philosophically possible to have an infinite past series of things and to arrive at today.
That makes perfect sense now. Thank you. Now,
Sure.
I know this next chapter, chapter 6, and then chapter 10, and then we'll wrap up with some updates from you about what you're doing these days. These are, I picked just a few chapters from your book for those of you listening. So hopefully you'll go and you'll get the book if it's still on sale to you. Otherwise, you'll get it anyway and read the rest of it. You won't be sorry. Chapter 6 was challenging for me. I know I'm really pushing myself to learn more about this because I need clarification on what it is that many Christians are upset when they hear the word evolution. I know there's evolutionary psychology, there's evolutionary biology, and people just kind of throw this word out there and sometimes don't distinguish between the two. So just to simplify the question for our audience and for you to just talk about what you think might be salient for us to know, um, what is it that Christians are concerned about when they hear the word evolution? Let's start with that. I mean, so what
Okay.
kinds of fears get pricked up here?
Sure. I want to preface my answer to this by saying that in my book or in any of the work I do not try to defend the theory of biological evolution. That is outside the scope of what I desire to do in terms of my scholarly work or even my lay level ministry work. And in the book, I don't defend the theory of biological evolution. No. Instead, what I'm trying very hard and very carefully to do is to tease apart these questions that have been confused in the conversation for a really long time. And you're hitting on it very precisely with your question to me. Many Christians, unfortunately, conflate the philosophy of metaphysical naturalism, in other words, this idea that God or anything like God doesn't exist, with the scientific theory of evolution. Now, it's understandable that this confusion has happened because there are many naturalistic scientists who use the theory of evolution to try to support their grand mythos of scientific materialism.
Right.
And so it does give this impression to someone that really doesn't know any better that, oh, evolution and metaphysical naturalism are inextricably linked, and evolutionary theory is a direct threat to the claim that a creator exists.
Right.
And that's completely false. Okay. There is no conflict involved between the pure scientific theory of evolution without the philosophical baggage of naturalism or scientific materialism, and the claim there is a creator. Okay, those two things, they just don't conflict. They can't conflict. Now, where you get into tension and potential conflict is when you then go to secondary claims. So our primary claim is that there is a creator. Well, then you go to secondary claims about how he created and how long it took to create, and so on and so forth. So then you get into some murky waters, and even within Orthodox Christianity, there's a whole lot of debate on those secondary questions. Yes. And that's where you can kind of get into some tension with the theory of biological evolution. But I wanted so much in my book to help people see the distinction between those kinds of questions and what is philosophically compatible and what is not.
Yeah, that really sets the record straight. And that part did come through very clearly. I'm rereading that chapter because there's so many other things. And actually, you've got me on a kick of reading about evolutionary psychology now and just trying to read more broadly about how sometimes we badly conflate, as you said, these things. And I think that will help people maybe take a second look at the subject. And I wish we could do more on that subject, but I want to finish with your second to last chapter, I think chapter 10, because this is an issue that I know, as you quote, J.P. Moreland has written a lot about, talked a lot about. I just recently finished Lee Strobel's new book about the afterlife and about heaven. And he mentioned, I think, was it Sharon Dirks, who does work And you didn't use the word, but a lot of your explanations in chapter 10 reminded me of his conversation with her about qualia and about experience, and how this idea that, try to describe what coffee smells like to somebody, right? Is very hard for us to do. And so we're getting into this conversation about the brain and the body and the existence of the soul. And this is what you talk about, as well as free will in chapter 10. So to finish, let me just kind of frame the question this way. You give three major positions in chapter 10: reductive physicalists, non-reductive physicalists, and dualists or substance dualists. Now, I think you carve out a niche within that third category, and you kind of explain how maybe you can explain it for us, but you believe that the mind or the soul and the brain can cooperate. But you're very clear about where you stand on this. So could you just give us the broad brushstrokes about those three positions, and then what's at stake here? I mean, if we're just brain and body, that's one option. And then there's, of course, the existence of the soul. So what is at stake with this question?
Okay.
Yeah.
To unpack the terms a little bit, reductive physicalists believe that our entire mental life, all of our mental experience, all of the states of consciousness that we have, thoughts, beliefs, desires, sensations, so on and so forth, that all of those things can be, when it comes to explaining them, reduced to the chemistry going on in your brain. Okay. So there really isn't a mind. There is only a brain doing its thing. And we use this word mind to describe the physical stuff going on in the gray matter in our skulls.
Right.
Okay, so that's the most extreme position, the reductive physicalism.
Okay.
Then we have what we call non-reductive physicalists. And they're still physicalists. They don't believe in an immaterial soul, but they will acknowledge that there are aspects of our mental life, properties, if you will, that are themselves immaterial, like a thought, for example, would be an immaterial thing that emerges from the physical stuff going on in our brain. Okay. So they're making a distinction between what's immaterial and what's material, and therefore what science can empirically investigate really, right? Because the immaterial has, to a large extent, this opaqueness as far as scientific investigation is concerned. So they'll at least acknowledge that, but the goals that they have in mind are really not accomplished by going this route, because at the end of the day, even these immaterial things like thoughts and beliefs and desires are completely dependent upon the physical substrate of the brain. So it's just inevitable that this thought is going to pop up because of the physical event that happened in the brain. There's no such thing as having a train of thought in any sort of free agency way, and that leading you to make free decisions about what you're thinking, for example.
Wow.
So that's the problem you have with even the non-reductive physicalism. And then we get to the dualistic, that's an umbrella, this dualistic idea that there is an immaterial aspect of a human person and a material aspect. I favor the view that's usually referred to as substance dualist interactionism. So I believe we have an immaterial soul that cooperates, to use your great term there, with the material aspect of our existence, our brains. So we have two things going on, but in this view, it's possible to have genuine agency. So we can freely think things and freely do things because it is the soul that's the agent, and the physical brain is, for lack of a better word, a mechanism.
Right.
through which the soul is able to interact with the physical world.
Yeah. Well, that sets the record straight about that. I would find myself in the same camp as you. And I really, from reading your book, got a better way of identifying clearly what I believe. So thank you for that.
Good,
And
good,
I
good.
really love the evidence you brought in from Moreland and your own elaboration on the arguments for dualism. So I don't know if we could just generalize it. What might you say is the strongest bit of evidence that suggests the veracity of this view that we hold of the dualistic view?
I think that there's so many good arguments that work together synergistically,
Mm-hmm.
but I could tell you what my favorite piece of evidence is.
Please.
So we could make arguments that are purely philosophical. We could talk about how there are properties of the mental that the physical doesn't have, and we could use Leibniz's law to say, therefore, there are things about the self and our mental life that cannot be identical to the physical stuff of our brain. In other words, the mind is not the brain. The mind is a separate entity to the brain, and they work together. So we could go the philosophical route. However, my favorite bit of evidence about this actually comes from the field of neuroscience.
Okay.
There's a psychiatrist by the name of Jeffrey Schwartz, and I talk about him in the book, who's a specialist in obsessive compulsive disorder. So for years and years and years, he's done investigative work into obsessive compulsive disorder, and he's developed various therapies for helping, behavioral therapies to help OCD patients largely recover from their obsessive compulsive thoughts and behaviors.
Wow.
And he has demonstrated, I think, quite compellingly, that thoughts can have effects on the material brain.
Wow.
For example, when he prescribes to his patients to carry out certain patterns of thoughts and to carry out certain methodical behaviors when they're experiencing an obsessive compulsive thought or this desire to do this obsessive compulsive behavior, he has figured out that if they do this over time, if they retrain their own thoughts with their own free will, that it can literally make physical changes in the brain. It creates new pathways in the brain. And so you have to ask the question, well, if the complete story of the mind is the brain and everything it does chemically, then what is it that's causing changes on it, right?
Yeah.
There's this intentional changing of the patterns in the brain.
See, that's amazing.
And so I think that's marvelous evidence that there is something more to the human person than just the physical stuff, that the agency is separate from the actual physical chemical events of the brain. Now, a fun anecdote about Dr. Schwartz is that he was the consultant for the Leonardo DiCaprio movie, The Aviator, which tells the story of the famous Howard Hughes. And Howard Hughes was a immense sufferer of obsessive compulsive disorder. And that's portrayed in the film in just such a poignant, powerful way. And the behind the scenes story is that DiCaprio actually went through training with Dr. Jeffrey Schwartz to get into the headspace of an OCD patient and to really get into character for this film. And if you've seen it, he does it magnificently, the way he portrays this OCD. So he went through all of this consulting and training with Dr. Schwartz. And then a while after the film was released, DiCaprio did an interview where he was talking about this. And he said, after we finished filming, it took me almost a year to get back to normal. I had to use Dr. Schwartz's techniques to train my brain back to normalcy.
Incredible.
Right. So that tells us, again, just to repeat myself for a third time, it tells us that we, in a very real sense, can use our behaviors and thoughts by way of free agency to make changes in the physical events going on in our brain. And that, to me, is a clear indication that the brain's not the whole story.
And that's fascinating, and almost seems to support the proverb, as a person thinks in their heart, so is he, that we can shape that plasticity you talk about of the brain with the soul or the mind. I know you say that mind is sort of a faculty of the soul, and that's just an amazing story and piece of evidence. And I love the Iron Man reference. You get to say, if you're a dualist, I am Iron Man. I mean, that's a benefit, right? So you got to read the book for many other reasons, but the Iron Man reference was awesome.
Yeah, that's just a teaser. I'm not going to unpack that.
No, that's great. Well, I want to save some time here now as we wrap up. I have to thank you so much for going through all this information. Tell us about what you have going on. I know you have a new book coming out. You have a Society of Women of Letters that you'd like to tell us some more about. If you want to mention the Worldview Bulletin, go ahead and take it away.
Yes. Okay. So I'll start with the book that I'm currently working on. The title of the book is Thinking God's Thoughts, Johannes Kepler and the Miracle of Cosmic Comprehensibility. It's a mouthful, cool. But this is related to my dissertation work, and it delves more deeply, far more deeply than Science in the Mind of the Maker does, into this idea of there being a resonance between human rationality and the transcendent rationality, our creator God. And Johannes Kepler features so prominently in the book because he's a pivotal figure in this line of thinking about how remarkable, or to use Einstein's word, miraculous it is that the universe is comprehensible. And Einstein famously said on more than one occasion, mind you, the fact that the universe is comprehensible is a miracle. And it was for these reasons that we've talked about earlier in the podcast.
Yeah.
Wow. So that's the book I'm working on now. My manuscript is due in January, so I still have a little bit of time, but I expect that it will hit bookstores, virtual and physical bookstores, sometime in the mid to late summer of 2022.
Excellent.
And then one of my very exciting new projects is the Society for Women of Letters. And this is a brand new society designed to bring together women from all of the humane disciplines together so that we can elevate the feminine voice in the Christian intellectual community, encourage one another, but also it has a very serious ministry element to it as well. What we're hoping is that by coming together and doing this project and highlighting the work that all of these amazing women are doing, all in this one society, we can be a light to many other women who may not be doing academic work, but who come to understand the importance of having a robust intellectual life for the glory of God. So we're hoping that we can be a positive influence on the women that have never thought about the importance of the intellectual side of the faith, and who want to come and join with us and get, focused formation in the humane disciplines, even if they have no plan to ever teach or do a higher degree in any of these things, to show them that the study of great literature, for example, can enhance their faith and enhance their evangelistic efforts as well. So very excited about the society.
Yeah,
the website is the Society for Women of Letters.com.
Okay.
And then, yes, thank you.
Of course.
And then finally, I'm pleased to say that I have recently joined the writing team for Worldview Bulletin. That is a subscription-based publication that is absolutely fantastic. I've written for them here and there over the years, but just this week I became a member of their core writing team. Very excited. And my fellow writers are Dr. David Baggett, Dr. Paul Copan, Dr. Paul Gould, and Christopher Reese. And I'm just honored to be in their ranks and help grow the Worldview Bulletin. So I encourage listeners to check out the website. There's a little bit of free content on there, but you get all the best stuff with a subscription.
Yes. And Dr. Gould's been on the show before. He's a friend, and he's now down here in sunny, humid, year-round Florida. So at Palm Beach, Atlantic, October, and it's still 90 degrees outside. So,
yeah. Well, I feel your pain here in the Houston area.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you for sharing all that with us, and Dr. Travis, thank you again for joining me today. It was a pleasure.
Sure.
To meet
Thank you for having me. This was so much fun. I got to talk about Tolkien and science and all the things all in 1 hour.
I know. And maybe next time we can do a Tolkien focused episode or something. We'll come up with something nerdy.
Sure. Oh, I know. We should talk about C.S. Lewis and the argument from reason, because that ties into the soul question.
That would be great. I've been thinking about that one and the argument from desire too, which is another good one that I love.
Oh, yes.
Very good. Well, I'm looking forward to it.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
See you next time.